Hello, everyone. My name is Gregory, and this is The View from Out Here. Now, if you've been watching, you'll remember that last week I told you that I would be reading an excerpt from one of my books. It's going to be this one, Searching for St. Germaine, the true story of a gay Catholic orphan. And this is chapter 13, St. Francis Infirmary. Now, to give you a little background, this is what's happening in the story. Um, I have just been through the worst foster family that I was ever in. There was a lot of abuse, mental, physical, sexual, the whole thing. It was just a nightmare. Okay. I'm 12 years old, and this is my first exposure to St. Francis Home for Boys, which later became the Paul Robeson Academy long after I left. And it has now been, there was a big fire, and so it's now been destroyed. There's nothing but a flat piece of land there right now at 2701 Finkel. Anyway, I give you now chapter 13 of Searching for St. Germaine. Okay, so here we go. This is chapter 13, Searching for St. Germaine. It's titled St. Francis Infirmary. As we rode along in Mr. Fox's white Chrysler that I liked so much, he was telling me about his good friend, Sister Dolores. Evidently, she was the Reverend Mother of St. Francis Home for Boys in Detroit, Michigan. In fact, that's where Mr. Fox was taking me at that very moment. He was chattering on about how much I was going to like St. Francis and how much fun I could look forward to having with all the other boys there. Although I found his voice soothing, I wasn't really listening. My agenda was a little different than Mr. Fox's. The last pair of shoes that had been handed down to me at Mrs. Ray's children's home evidently had some sort of fungus or something that turned the ends of my toes into gooey-looking weeping sores that stuck to my socks. They hurt awfully bad, but that wasn't even the main thing on my mind as Mr. Fox prattled on about St. Francis Home for Boys. What was foremost in my mind was how much this was looking like yet another stop on what was beginning to look like an endless journey taking me further and further away from the one thing in all the world that I so deeply longed for. I wanted to go home. I didn't realize at the time that home, as I knew it, didn't even exist anymore. Try as I might, I could not make anyone in charge understand that I wasn't interested in fun, new friends, school, cameras, radios, ice cream, carnival rides, baseball cards, zoo animals, movies, or looking to the future. I was focused on getting my squishy little ass back home. I wanted my mom back. Unfortunately, that was the one thing Mr. Fox and the state of Michigan, with all of its resources, could not materialize. All of this talk about Sister Dolores and all the fun I was going to have was falling on deaf ears, and I'm pretty sure Mr. Fox knew it. As we approached St. Francis, I was stricken by the sheer size of it. It was a grand-looking brick building with sweeping arches and a row of what looked like turrets along the top, like you might see along the top of old European castles. What I learned later was that these turrets were the alcove windows of the dorm I would be living in. It resembled something right out of a medieval adventure movie. I half expected somebody like Errol Flynn or Peter O'Toole to come swashbuckling out from behind the building on a big white horse to save the day. The fact that it was a somewhat cloudy and misty day probably contributed to my imaginings that I was having in my head. I was suddenly a visiting dignitary on a secret mission for Queen Elizabeth, and I was being escorted by the trusty knight Sir Virgil of Foxworth, who had been dispatched to provide for my protection on the journey. Just as my mind got started filling in the rest of the story, the car came to a stop in front of the steps leading to the big oak doors of the entrance. Mr. Fox turned off the car and turned to me to reassure me one last time that I was going to love it here. This time, I think he was saying it more for himself than for me. I'm reasonably sure by now that he knew that trying to get me excited about moving to yet another strange place was a lost cause. The meeting with Sister Dolores was a short one. All the arrangements about my move had already been made. Sister Dolores began to echo what Mr. Fox had been telling me on the way over. I was going to have the most wonderful time here. Mr. Fox told her about the sores on my feet. They excused themselves and stepped out of the room for a moment for some confidential discussion, leaving me with another nun who was probably there as a receptionist. I was not in the least bit concerned about their departure or their secrecy. I had long since become accustomed to it. You might say that it was standard operational procedure by that time. Decisions would be made by adults charged with my care about where I would live and go to school and who would be responsible for me. None of that would be within my purview. I was being moved around from place to place for reasons that would be invisible to me. Meanwhile, in the reception area, the nun was making some announcements on the intercom and noticed that I seemed interested, which I was, and she began to explain how the intercom worked. She had barely begun when the two returned. Mr. Fox assured me one last time that I would be fine. He said his goodbyes and left by the door we had just come in. As the door closed behind him, my heart sank with the realization that I was, once again, all alone in a strange place. It was as if my escape route back to anything familiar was sealed shut with the sound of that big oak door closing behind him. I started crying. Sister Dolores tried to comfort me, and she was a professional. That's what nuns do, for heaven's sake. But my eyes simply would not obey me and proceeded to flood with tears despite my best efforts. I so very deeply hated this feeling of being alone in a place where there was absolutely nothing that remained of yesterday except this longing that I was now so familiar with. I had prayed over and over that all of this shuffling around would one day end, but it never did. Once again, there was that feeling that this time could not be held back until I could cry it out privately. Sister Dolores led me, still crying, down a few hallways and through a choir loft in the chapel to the infirmary. She gently held her hand on my shoulder the entire way from the lobby and spoke quietly as we walked. She told me that the sisters there would look after my feet and see if they could make them better. Little did I know that as she turned me over to the nuns in the infirmary, that I would not see her again face to face until over a year later when I would be embroiled in a censorship scuffle over an article I had written for a school newspaper I had founded. That first night, I lay there in yet another unfamiliar bed. The nuns had bathed me, fed me, and encouraged me into a clean pair of someone else's pajamas. I guess I should have been grateful, and maybe somewhere inside I was. But the unfamiliarity with my surroundings and the fact that there was absolutely no one in this new world that I knew yesterday made me feel so empty. After putting me to bed, the sisters turned off the lights and went somewhere I couldn't see. The infirmary became very quiet. For a while, I watched a moth flutter around an exit light just across the hall from the room I was in. The little guy kept bumping into the glass, trying in vain to get closer to the source of the light. I knew the feeling. The dim reddish light from the exit sign reflected off the prison gray paint on the ceiling created a brooding brown wash that shone down on my face just bright enough to keep me awake for a while. All was quiet but for the sound of water running through some old pipes nearby. I could vaguely hear voices from another room, just barely loud enough to be audible, but not loud enough to make out any words. The voices seemed jovial, and it made me wish that I felt differently. As I had often done on my first night in a new place, I began to review my life up to that point. I desperately tried to figure out what I had done or what I had lacked that kept me away from the people I loved. I hated the fact that I was effeminate and obsequious and there didn't seem to be anything I could do about it. I was doing the best I could and it felt like I was never enough to belong anywhere. What could I have done that was so bad? Why doesn't my mom come and get me and take me home? Where are my brother Mike and my cousins? What will become of me? The questions piled up unanswered like so many dishes on the counter by the sink. I could no longer contain the longing. My tears, as if by their own volition, quietly flowed down my face to the pillow. I tried, like I always do, to keep it quiet so as not to attract any attention to my deep loneliness. It was too uncomfortable to try to explain to total strangers what I had been through up to now, what it felt like to be unwanted by my parents and separated from my brother and my cousins. I wondered what they were thinking about me being gone like this. Lying there, I was recalling how many times I had found myself in this same situation over and over. I wondered if it would ever end. I was crying for someone familiar to hold me and tell me everything would be all right. But of course, no one came, and everything would not always be all right. One of the nuns must have heard me sniffling and came to the door of the room. "Are you crying?" she whispered. "No," I quietly lied. She gave me that look. You know the one, the compassionate motherly look that I think they must teach in nun school. They can all do it. I tried to deny anything was wrong, but the woman was undeterred. She sat in the chair near the end of the bed and rested a calming hand on my ankle. She began to talk. She had a kind demeanor and her voice was soothing, so I let her go on, even though I'd have preferred to cry alone. She was telling me she knew how I felt, left alone in the world with no one to turn to. But, she said, there are parents who will never desert you, who will be there for you whenever you need them, and they will never, ever leave you. She told me a few stories about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and God the Father. Of course, I knew about them already, but I had never put them into quite that context before. As she continued to tell me about how loving and nurturing I could expect Mother Mary to be, and how much Mary wanted me to be her son just like Jesus was, it began to make sense to me. My crying slowed down as I gently began listening more intently to what she was saying. Could this be possible, I thought? Or is this just another ploy to get me to accept what was happening to me, even though I knew it wasn't right for someone to have to go through this over and over? As I lay there listening to her go on about Mary and Jesus and God the Father, I began to relax and eventually fell asleep. When I awoke the next morning, there on the chair where the nun had been sitting last night was a little plastic glow-in-the-dark statue of Mother Mary and a little book of prayers. As I wiped the sleep from my eyes, a little bit of calm came over me. Although I wasn't really into this, something inside of me felt like this maybe wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe I could pick myself up and try to find some good in all of this. Maybe even enjoy myself a little. I was here and I was still alive. Given what I had been through, I knew very well that my life could be even worse. That little statue remained a constant companion through my time at St. Francis. It was just barely small enough to fit in my pocket. I remember how it used to delight me that I could hold her up to the light before going to bed and then get under the covers when they turned out the dorm lights, and I could see her features so kind, so gentle, glowing so clearly. Sometimes just having that statue made me feel a little bit better. I do not recall if I ever saw the nun who gave it to me again. Okay, so that was chapter 13 of my book, Searching for St. Germaine, the true story of a gay Catholic orphan. I want to thank you for hanging with me so far, and if you're finding anything of value here, please take a second to like and subscribe with the buttons below. And you will also find links to both of these two books down there and some other stuff. So anyway, have a look at that. Meanwhile, much love.